Off the coast of Nova Scotia, in a bay full of quiet islands, there is one place that has spent more than 2 centuries doing something almost impossible. It has kept people digging without ever giving them a clear answer. Oak Island is not mysterious because a chest of gold was found and then lost again. It is mysterious because generation after generation became convinced that something important had been hidden there, and every time they tried to prove it, the island answered with another collapse, another flooded shaft, another promising clue that seemed to point in 10 different directions at once. That is what makes Oak Island so dangerous to the imagination. It never closes the case. It only rearranges the questions. The story usually begins in 1795 with a teenager named Daniel McGinnis. According to the legend, he noticed a depression in the ground beneath an old oak and thought it looked unnatural. He returned with friends, and the boys began digging. Very early in the tale, Oak Island becomes hard to separate from the mythology built around it. Some versions add a hanging block and tackle. Some insist there were carefully placed layers of logs at regular intervals. Others emphasize the disciplined structure of the shaft, as if it had been engineered to lure anyone curious enough to keep going. That uncertainty matters. Oak Island did not enter history as a neatly documented discovery. It entered as a story retold, embellished, challenged, and believed just enough to keep attracting new believers. What is not disputed is that the legend grew fast. Once the rumor of a buried cache took hold, searchers came back with money, workers, and a greater willingness to dig deeper. The supposed shaft became known as the Money Pit, and from that point on, Oak Island stopped being just a small island and became an obsession. Every generation seemed to inherit the same emotional trap. If earlier searchers had found strange layers of wood, charcoal, putty, or coconut fiber, then surely they had been close. If someone had once recovered a stone with symbols carved into it, then surely there had been a code to read. If salt water kept rushing in when the pit reached a certain depth, then surely hidden flood tunnels had been built to protect whatever lay below. The story kept offering a logic that was just believable enough to survive failure. That is one reason Oak Island is so hard to dismiss. Many legendary treasure stories collapse the moment you ask simple questions. Oak Island does not collapse so easily because it developed through real digging, real expense, real engineering, and real disappointment. Search companies did not just tell stories there. They sank shafts, built equipment, drained areas, drilled cores, and destroyed parts of the island trying to force the truth out of it. The result is almost paradoxical. The more people tried to solve Oak Island, the more confusing its physical history became. Old shafts intersected later shafts. Flooded zones blurred original features. Explosions, collapses, pumping systems, and emergency work altered the ground until the island itself became a damaged record of its own investigation. The famous flood story is at the center of that confusion. One of Oak Island's most enduring claims is that searchers reached a depth where seawater suddenly poured into the Money Pit, as if a hidden trap had been waiting for exactly that moment. Over time, this turned into the idea of elaborate man-made flood tunnels running from Smith's Cove toward the pit, packed with materials like coconut fiber and eelgrass to filter the water. For believers, this is the strongest proof that Oak Island contains something deliberate. Natural geology does not lay out a theatrical defense system. Human hands do. But skeptics push back hard here. Some argue the island's geology, erosion, and generations of disturbed ground created a story that later searchers interpreted as engineering. Others believe that at least some of the so-called tunnel evidence may have been tied to unrelated activity, shoreline works, or the chaos created by treasure hunts themselves. Oak Island lives in that narrow zone where the engineering theory sounds possible, yet never becomes final. Then there is the inscribed stone, maybe the most famous missing object in the whole legend. For years, people repeated that a carved stone was found deep in the original shaft and later translated to mean that a fortune lay buried below. It is the kind of detail every mystery needs: a message, a code, a hidden promise of treasure beneath the ground. The problem is that the stone itself became part of the uncertainty. Accounts of the inscription vary. The translation appeared much later. Some researchers have argued that the whole story around the stone became exaggerated or unreliable over time. That does not prove there was never an unusual stone. It only means one of Oak Island's most dramatic clues may also be one of its least stable pieces of evidence. And that is almost the perfect symbol for the island. Its most irresistible clues are often the ones you trust least after looking closely. As the 19th century went on, new companies took over, each convinced that the last group had failed because it lacked money, patience, or the right method. The Onslow Company is often remembered as one of the earliest organized efforts, followed by later groups who widened the pit, drilled nearby, and tried to outsmart the flooding problem. But Oak Island did not reward persistence with clarity. It rewarded it with accidents, contradictory reports, and artifacts that only deepened the argument. Fragments of chain, bits of wood, pieces of parchment, odd metals, and traces of worked materials became fuel for new theories. Were these signs of a hidden vault? Remains from earlier attempts. Random debris carried by disturbed soil. Once Oak Island learned how to produce ambiguous evidence, it never stopped. The deaths associated with the search added another layer of dread. Over the years, multiple searchers died in accidents connected to excavation, collapses, toxic gases, or heavy machinery. From those tragedies, a darker superstition spread, that 7 people must die before Oak Island gives up its secret. Whether that curse has any meaning is not really the point. The point is that the island absorbed those deaths into its legend and became more than a treasure story. It became a place where ambition, bad luck, and obsession seemed to travel together. That kind of atmosphere changes how people read every clue. A flooded shaft stops looking like an engineering problem and starts feeling like resistance. A missing artifact stops looking like bad record keeping and starts feeling like intentional concealment. By the 20th century, the search was already long enough to give every new investor a strange sense of inherited destiny. Instead of asking whether the original story was even reliable, many searchers began from the opposite assumption. If so many people had come this far, surely the mystery must have had a core of truth worth defending. That is how Oak Island kept recruiting new believers. It was not only the legend of buried wealth. It was the psychological force of all the time, labor, and money already spent. The island had become an unfinished sentence, and nobody wanted to be the person who walked away 1 foot from the period. One of the most famous 20th century chapters involves a deep shaft known as 10X. To some searchers, it looked like a possible shortcut into the hidden system beneath the island. Underwater footage from that shaft inspired years of argument. People claimed to see tools, wooden structures, even the suggestion of human remains or a chamber. But interpretation was always the problem. Murky images collected in difficult conditions invite belief and misreading in equal measure. Was 10X a breakthrough? A geological cavity? A confused blend of debris from previous operations? The answer kept slipping away. Like so much else on Oak Island, 10X became one more site where visual evidence could be turned into either certainty or doubt depending on what you already wanted the island to be. What makes Oak Island especially fascinating is that it supports several mutually incompatible stories at the same time. To some, it is pirate territory, and the missing treasure belongs to Captain Kidd or another seaborne fortune hunter who needed an isolated place to hide loot. To others, the scale of the supposed underground works points away from pirates and toward a state or military operation. There are theories involving French treasure, British military secrets, religious relics, private wartime deposits, and even the lost manuscripts of Shakespeare. Some theories drift into the orbit of the Knights Templar, imagining Oak Island as the endpoint of a secret route that carried sacred objects from Europe to the New World. Other explanations are much less romantic. Maybe the island was used for industry, salt production, storage, or coastal work later mistaken for treasure engineering. Maybe the Real treasure was the legend itself, profitable because it kept attracting fresh capital long after the original evidence became hopelessly contaminated. The Templar theory deserves its own pause, if only because it shows how Oak Island pulls serious people toward extravagant ideas. It usually begins with the assumption that certain stone formations, symbols, cross-shaped finds, or hidden structures hint at medieval visitors. Add in the romance of vanished orders, secret maps, and relics carried across the Atlantic, and Oak Island starts to resemble a historical thriller rather than a cold case in Nova Scotian soil. The problem is not that these theories are exciting. The problem is that they often rely on long chains of association where every link is weaker than the last. A medieval-style artifact does not prove medieval builders. A mysterious symbol does not prove a hidden order. A lead cross or old coin may be genuinely intriguing without telling the grand story believers want it to tell. Oak Island makes this mistake easy because it offers just enough physical evidence to support imagination while withholding the final piece that could rule fantasy out. And yet, dismissing the island as total nonsense feels too easy as well. Over time, investigators really have found things that suggest human activity on Oak Island long before modern television turned the mystery into a franchise. Coconut fiber is not native to Nova Scotia. Old worked wood, traces of structures near Smith's Cove, metal objects, historical fragments, and shoreline features all suggest that something happened there. The question is not whether Oak Island was ever used by people with plans. The question is whether those plans involved hidden treasure, complex engineering, and intentional deception on a scale grand enough to justify 2 centuries of obsession. That question is still open, and that openness is the island's real power. Modern investigation made the mystery look cleaner on television, but the underlying problem never changed. New drilling methods, scans, archaeology, dendrochronology, metallurgy, and careful artifact study can narrow possibilities. They can date materials, compare origins, and separate older activity from later disturbance. They can tell us whether a fragment of wood was cut centuries ago or whether a metal piece resembles military, maritime, or domestic equipment. But even modern tools run into Oak Island's greatest defense: the site has been disturbed for too long by too many people chasing too many different ideas. Every older shaft risks collapsing into another. Every recovered fragment may have been moved by flooding, drilling, or previous searchers. The island is not a sealed crime scene. It is a crime scene, a salvage yard, a worksite, a legend factory, and an archaeological puzzle all piled on top of each other. That is why even exciting modern discoveries can feel strangely incomplete. A coin, a brooch, an old cross, worked timber, bits of parchment, ancient fibers, unusual stonework, or buried pathways can all be real finds. They can all matter. But none of them automatically answers the central question everyone keeps asking. Was something deliberately hidden on Oak Island, and if so, what was it? This is the frustration that has preserved the mystery. The evidence is never empty enough to end the story, and never decisive enough to finish it. Some of the best explanations are also the least cinematic. One skeptical line of thinking argues that Oak Island may be a perfect storm of ordinary history and extraordinary storytelling. The island sat in a region shaped by fishing, shipping, military movement, coastal work, and centuries of Atlantic traffic. Materials from different eras could have ended up there without requiring a single masterplot. Once the treasure legend took hold, every later discovery began serving the story whether it belonged to that story or not. Searchers dug shafts expecting evidence and often found exactly the kind of ambiguous remains that expectation turns into proof. In that version, Oak Island is less a hidden vault than a machine for producing confirmation bias. But the skeptical view has its own weakness. It can sometimes sound too neat, too confident, too certain that generations of searchers were merely gullible. That feels unsatisfying because the island really does contain layers of labor and oddity that resist total reduction. Why did some searchers repeatedly encounter what appeared to be structured materials below ground? Why do shoreline works near Smith's Cove continue to provoke debate? Why did the island attract such persistent effort from people who saw more than rumor in the ground beneath their feet? Maybe the answer is that there never was one treasure, one tunnel system, or one event. Maybe Oak Island accumulated episodes over centuries, each leaving traces, and later searchers combined those traces into a single legend because a single legend is easier to believe than a messy timeline of unrelated human actions. That possibility may be the most unsettling one of all. Not that Oak Island hides a king's ransom or sacred relic, but that it is a layered historical palimpsest mistaken for a single engineered secret. Imagine an island used by different people at different times for different purposes: storage, shoreline work, temporary camps, salvage, private hiding, perhaps even small-scale industry. Add erosion, burial, reconstruction, rumor, treasure fever, and repeated excavation. The result would look exactly like Oak Island looks now: suggestive, contradictory, and almost impossible to read cleanly. In that scenario, the island is not less mysterious. It is more mysterious because the truth would not be a single revelation. It would be 100 partial ones that never fit together into a satisfying ending. There is also a darker social history inside the mystery. Oak Island has devoured fortunes, reputations, and decades of human life. It has turned hope into identity. Once people commit themselves to a search like that, abandoning it becomes psychologically difficult. Every sunk cost argues for one more season, one more shaft, one more scan, one more interpretation of a clue that almost fits. The island becomes not only a site of mystery, but a study in how human beings interact with uncertainty. Most people say they want answers. Oak Island suggests that many people actually want the state just before the answer, where possibility is still alive and no final discovery can disappoint the dream. That may explain why the island thrives in the age of modern media. Television did not create Oak Island, but it gave the mystery a new ecosystem. Weekly episodes, fresh discoveries, expert consultations, drone footage, and cliffhanger language make the island feel current, as though it is always one drill hole away from surrender. That ongoingness matters. Oak Island is not treated as a closed historical legend. It is performed as a live mystery, and that format reshapes how audiences think about evidence. A fragment becomes a sign. A dating result becomes a pivot. A void becomes a promise. Even when the data are ambiguous, the structure of serialized storytelling encourages belief that momentum itself means progress. And yet progress on Oak Island is always slippery. Every apparent step forward opens two new routes into uncertainty. If there was engineering beneath the island, who built it? If there was no engineered treasure vault, why do some features seem deliberate? If artifacts from different centuries appear, does that mean a long-hidden tradition or simply a long record of unrelated visitors? If flood tunnels were real, what exactly were they defending? If they were not real, why did so many experienced searchers become convinced they were? Oak Island does not just hide a possible object. It hides the correct frame for interpreting the entire site. This is where the island becomes more philosophical than archaeological. What does it mean to solve a mystery like this? Is it enough to prove no legendary treasure ever existed? For many believers, no. That would only move the mystery to another level. Then what explains the works, the shafts, the fibers, the artifacts, the stories? Is it enough to find one cache of valuables? Again, maybe not. A chest of coins would not automatically validate the larger mythology. It could be a later hiding place rather than the original secret. On Oak Island, even discovery might not end argument. The island is structured so that every answer arrives already carrying a doubt behind it. Perhaps that is why the strongest modern interpretations tend to avoid certainty. Responsible investigators can say that the legend begins in the late 18th century, that repeated excavation transformed the site, that evidence exists for historical activity on the island, and that some claims around the money pit are stronger than others. They can point out that the famous inscribed stone is controversial, that flood tunnel narratives remain debated, and that many artifacts are intriguing without being conclusive. They can also say that the search itself is now part of the island's history, not separate from it. But after all that caution, the old emotional question still returns. If there was never anything there, why does the island keep feeling like it is one clue short of confession? That may be the cruelest aspect of Oak Island. It does not need to prove a treasure ever existed in order to feel unfinished. The unfinished feeling is built into the record itself. There were enough discoveries to keep people digging, enough failures to keep the legend dark, enough deaths to give it a curse, and enough contradictions to prevent closure. It is one of the rare mysteries where the evidence and the folklore have grown so tightly together that separating them may no longer be possible. The island we talk about now is not just land in Mahone Bay. It is the accumulated weight of every shaft, every rumor, every investor, every death, every broken machine, every found object, and every sentence that begins with the words "maybe this time." So what is the real secret of Oak Island? Maybe it is a hidden deposit placed there centuries ago and still waiting beneath collapsed works no one has interpreted correctly. Maybe it is a much smaller historical act that expanded into one of the longest treasure hunts on Earth. Maybe the engineering was real, but the thing it protected has already been destroyed, removed, or never reached. Or maybe the greatest secret is that Oak Island trained generations of people to mistake ambiguity for an invitation. It taught them that uncertainty can feel more valuable than proof. That is why the money pit still matters. Not because we know what was hidden there, but because we do not. Oak Island stands at the strange point where evidence is real, legend is powerful, and certainty remains just out of reach. Every theory feels almost strong enough. Every clue feels almost decisive enough. Every explanation leaves a residue behind that the next explanation has to absorb. And so the island survives, still silent, still unfinished, still capable of making rational people stare at the ground and imagine that somewhere under the collapsed shafts and flooded voids, one final answer is waiting for a hand patient enough to find it. Maybe that answer is treasure. Maybe it is only history distorted by obsession. Maybe it is a site that was never one mystery, but several. Whatever the truth is, Oak Island has already achieved something stranger than buried gold. It turned uncertainty itself into inheritance. More than 200 years after the first digging story, the island still does exactly what it has always done. It offers just enough evidence to make leaving feel foolish, and just enough doubt to make staying feel necessary. And that is why Oak Island remains one of history's most dangerous mysteries. Not because it has been solved. Because after all this time, it still has not decided what kind of mystery it wants to be. Subscribe to Shadow Archive for more dark history documentaries.